Welcome to this deep dive. We try to take these complex topics and just pull out the insights that really matter for you.
Mm-hmm.
And today, we're tackling something pretty significant, potentially unsettling even. It's this discussion that's been bubbling up about possibly suspending habeas corpus in the United States.
Yeah, there's a recent video from Midas Touch that's really brought this into focus. And, it touches on the absolute bedrock of our legal system.
Right. And when you hear things like that, it's easy to feel maybe a bit overwhelmed or uneasy, like you said.
Absolutely. Legal stuff, constitutional matters, they can seem really dense. So our goal today is just clarity. We want to focus on the core arguments, the information out there.
Using that Midas Touch video, but also analysis from legal commentator Harry Litman. And then there's that statement from Stephen Miller, too.
Exactly. We just want to understand, what's being said, what's the context, and what could it mean?
Yeah, we're definitely not aiming to become constitutional lawyers in, the next half hour or so.
No. Just grasp the essentials.
Okay, so the Midas Touch video. It kicks off with this central claim that the former Trump administration, as they put it, is thinking about suspending habeas corpus.
Right. And it's presented not just as some, abstract idea.
No. Harry Litman, in the video, he really stresses this point. He says it's not figurative, it's literal. They're literally considering it.
That's a heavy claim. And the video suggests a reason why this might be on the table.
What's the argument there?
Well, the perspective in the video is that it's a reaction to what they describe as consistent legal defeats. Losing in court, basically.
Even in courts with judges appointed by Republican administrations, right?
Yeah, that's part of the argument. They mention the Abreu-Garcia case as one example.
Okay.
Where the courts, including the Supreme Court, ruled in a way that facilitated a return, which
Right.
kind of goes against claims of, a 9 will win.
So the underlying idea presented is that there's this feeling within that camp that the courts just aren't doing the right thing on due process?
Exactly. And due process, just for anyone maybe less familiar, what does that generally mean in these situations?
Well, broadly, it's about fair treatment through the normal judicial system, like getting notice of charges, having a chance to be heard in court.
Right. Basic fairness procedures. So if you're detained, the government has to follow established legal steps. They can't just lock you up indefinitely without reason.
Got it. So, okay, they're losing in court. They feel the courts aren't doing the right thing.
Yeah.
What's justification they supposedly offer for suspending habeas corpus then?
Right. So the video explains the argument goes something like this. Invoking the Alien Enemies Act.
The Alien Enemies Act, that sounds old.
It is. It dates back to 1798. And it gives the president certain powers over foreign nationals during a declared war or, crucially, an invasion.
Invasion. And the video connects this to
Venezuela. The claim presented is that there's a perceived war or invasion situation, specifically pointing fingers at Venezuela.
Okay, but the video questions that justification, doesn't it?
It does, strongly. It brings up intelligence community reports, apparently, from the former administration's own director of national intelligence.
And these reports say what?
Well, according to the video, they contradict the idea of an invasion from Venezuela, suggesting the factual basis for invoking the act might be, shaky.
So the justification itself is under question.
Precisely. Which leads us right into that key piece of the puzzle, the clip of Stephen Miller.
Okay, what does Miller say in this clip?
He says suspending habeas corpus is, and I quote, an option we're actively looking at during what he calls a time of invasion.
Actively looking at. That sounds quite direct.
It does, but then he adds this really important condition, a big if.
Which is?
He says it depends on whether the court should do the right thing or not.
Yeah. Okay, so we're looking at suspending this fundamental right.
Yeah.
If the courts don't rule the way we want. How does the video interpret that?
The interpretation in the Midas Touch video is pretty stark. They see it not just as outlining a possibility, but as a direct threat.
A threat to the Supreme Court.
That's how they frame it. An attempt to pressure the judiciary. Basically saying, rule our way, or we might suspend constitutional rights.
And they even mention the potential for, tanks on the street if things don't go their way.
Yeah, the video suggests that this implies a potential breakdown of order, raising the specter of significant unrest if unfavorable rulings lead to such drastic executive action. It's presented as a very forceful interpretation of Miller's words, like extortion.
Okay, this really highlights why we need to understand habeas corpus itself. We keep saying it's fundamental, but what is it exactly? Why is suspending it such a huge deal?
Yeah, good question. At its core, habeas corpus, it literally means you shall have the body, is a legal protection. It lets someone who's detained challenge the legality of that detention in front of a judge.
So the government can't just hold you indefinitely without showing a valid legal reason.
Exactly. It's a cornerstone protection against, arbitrary imprisonment by the government, by the executive branch. It goes way back, even referenced in relation to Magna Carta. It ensures people are either charged with a crime or released.
Okay, that makes its importance crystal clear. So the Constitution itself, Article 1, it does allow for suspension, but only under very specific circumstances.
Correct. The clause says, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it.
Rebellion or invasion and public safety may require it. Big conditions. Now, the crucial question, who gets to decide if those conditions are actually met? The president.
Well, that's a key point of debate highlighted in the video, particularly by Litman. The argument is that determining if a rebellion or invasion truly exists and if public safety requires suspension isn't solely up to the executive.
Should involve the courts.
That's the view presented. It's a judicial question, part of the whole separation of powers idea. The courts are meant to interpret the law and the Constitution, including those clauses.
And the video also mentions Congress potentially having a role, referencing Lincoln during the Civil War.
Right. Historically, it's complex. Lincoln did suspend habeas corpus during the Civil War, which was undeniably a massive rebellion.
But was that solely his decision?
Well, his initial actions were debated constitutionally. Congress later passed laws that, in effect, authorized or ratified some of those suspensions. It highlights that tension, between executive action in crisis and the roles laid out in the Constitution, potentially involving Congress.
And the video mentioned post-9/11 too.
Yeah, it briefly touched on that. After 9/11, there were legal battles over detaining individuals, enemy combatants, and their access to courts. The Supreme Court, in cases like Hamdi v. Rumsfeld, pushed back against the idea that habeas corpus could simply be ignored, emphasizing the need for some form of legal process, even in national security situations.
Okay. Shifting gears slightly, the video brings up another concern. Non-lawyers making major legal policy decisions.
Yes. They point out that Stephen Miller isn't a licensed lawyer.
And they draw a parallel.
To Jim Jordan, mentioned as leading the Judiciary Committee without being an attorney. The analogy used is like having a non-licensed doctor making critical medical policy decisions.
So the core worry is about expertise.
Exactly. The concern raised is whether individuals without that deep legal training fully grasp the nuances, the complexities, and the potential downstream consequences of messing with fundamental rights like habeas corpus. It questions the influence of non-legal experts in these very specific legal domains.
Right. And then circling back to Miller's statement one more time, the video really doubles down on interpreting it as a threat, doesn't it?
It does. They call it a premeditated threat to the Supreme Court, comparing it to mobster tactics.
That whole, if you don't do what I want, bad things will happen kind of vibe.
That's the characterization, yeah. And they also note that in the clip shown, Miller apparently misstates the actual constitutional clause about suspension.
So wrapping up the video's perspective, what's the final takeaway they leave viewers with?
A pretty strong sense of alarm. They describe the whole discussion under these alleged circumstances and justifications as sinister and mob-like. The concluding sentiment is one of grave concern about the potential trampling of constitutional rights if habeas corpus were suspended based on, political pressure or executive whim rather than genuine constitutional grounds.
Okay, so let's recap this deep dive for everyone. We've looked at the claims, primarily from that Midas Touch video, about a potential plan to suspend habeas corpus.
We explored the suggested reasons presented as a reaction to court losses, and the specific justification floated involving the old Alien Enemies Act and a disputed claim of invasion from Venezuela.
Right, a claim apparently contradicted by intelligence reports cited in the video. We also analyzed that key statement from Stephen Miller,
where he called suspension an option they're actively looking at, but crucially added the condition about whether the court does the right thing.
And we discussed the video's interpretation of that as a direct pressure tactic, even a threat, aimed at the Supreme Court.
We also touched on why habeas corpus is so vital, that fundamental protection against being locked up without legal cause, and the strict constitutional limits on its suspension, found in Article 1.
Discussing who gets to decide if those limits are met, the executive alone, or the courts, maybe even Congress, looking at historical examples like Lincoln and post-9/11.
And finally, we covered the concerns raised in the video about non-lawyers like Miller, having significant influence over complex legal and constitutional policy.
Which really brings us to the core issue for you, the listener, to think about. Habeas corpus isn't just some dusty legal phrase.
No, it's fundamental. It's a direct safeguard for your liberty against potential government overreach. It speaks volumes about the balance of power we expect in a democracy.
So here's something to really chew on. What are the potential long-term implications for the rule of law for your own freedoms if fundamental rights like habeas corpus start to seem negotiable?
Yeah, negotiable based on political wins or executive desires rather than clear constitutional criteria. It really makes you think about the essential role of an independent judiciary, doesn't it? How vital is that branch in actually safeguarding these rights for everyone?